Good morning. I want to invite you today to Matthew, the 6th chapter, if you'll open there, please, the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 is where we're going to read together. Matthew 6, verse 19. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. We're going to come back to the context of this verse in just a little bit, or this section in just a little bit, but where I want us to focus our attention this morning is on a very wise and insightful statement that Jesus makes in verse 21 at the end of this text when he says, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." I want us to think a little bit about the connection between our treasure, about where we invest ourselves, about where we make deposits, and our feelings. Jesus says there's a connection between where I pour my energies, where I pour my interest, where I invest my behavior, and my feelings, my emotions, or my heart. He says that there's a connection between the two. He says that where I invest myself is where I'm going to feel strongly, and where I don't invest myself, I'm not going to feel very strongly about that. And he uses that in order to make a point here about where we ought to be investing ourselves, where we ought to be laying up treasure, where we ought to be making our deposits. And so he says we should make deposits that are heavenly. We should make investments that are in a place where there's total security, where rust can't corrupt, where there's no moth that can come and eat holes in it, and where there is no thief that can break in and steal the things that we've stored up. And so he implores us to make investments that are heavenly, rather ones that are carnal, because everything that we invest here is all destined for decay and corruption or for the vice of men. So he says, lay up your treasures in heaven rather than laying up your treasures here on earth. I want to extend the principle that he states for us there in verse 21 to all the different facets of our feelings, to all the things that we have feelings about, whether they be feelings of affection or whether they be feelings of antipathy, whether they be feelings of strong feelings of resolve about something, or whether they be feelings of indifference or even feelings of hatred, and how it is that those feelings are formed. Because the principle that Jesus states here applies to every feeling and every passion that's a part of the human heart. They come as the consequence of our choices. A wise man said to me when I was in college, your feelings follow your choices. And what he was saying in his own way, the very same thing that Jesus is saying here in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 21. When he said to me, your feelings follow your choices, he's saying that the choices that you make are the things that define the ways that you feel. So the things that you love are the consequence of prior choices that you've made that have created that affection in you. The things that you hate are things that you hate because there have been prior choices that have been made, and regular investments, regular deposits into those choices that have then created that feeling. Your feelings follow the choices that you make. Now, I want us to test that together today, and some of the other truths that are incidental, that are connected to that truth, and see whether that's true, whether that is so or not. I aver that it is. And that insight has helped me a lot with changing the way that I feel about things that I ought to love that I hate, and hating things that I love. And we've all found ourselves in predicaments or in situations where we feel things that we ought not to feel, and where those feelings need to change. And Jesus has given us an insight here that can help us with that. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. You care about what you invest in. You will not care about what you don't invest in. The repeated deposit of yourself into any pursuit, the deposit of your thoughts, the deposit of your words, the deposit of your actions, the repeated deposit of yourself into any pursuit will strengthen your feelings for that pursuit. Is that true? You know what happens to a fellow that plays a lot of golf? The more he plays it, the more he loves it. I mean, the stronger his feelings are, right? Because he's doing things that strengthen his affection for that. And you know, it's not just what he does. It's not just that he gets out on the course and that he plays. But you take a fellow that plays golf, and guess what he's going to talk about? He's going to talk about his golf game. So he's going to talk about the best clubs. He's going to talk about the best ball to use. He's going to talk about the best shoes. He's going to talk about the best places, the best courses to play. He's going to compare. He's going to love to have conversations with others that like to talk about golf too. And they're going to, and the talk, is that a behavior that's going to strengthen his affection for golf? Yeah. So just like playing does, just like what he does strengthens his heart for that, so does his speech. But you know what else he's going to do? He's going to watch a lot of golf. And he's going to read golf magazines. And he's going to browse things on the internet that have to do with golf. And so it's not just what he does, and it's not just what he says, it's also what he thinks that's going to reinforce that. The more that he thinks about it, the more that he talks about it, the more that he does it, all of those actions together are going to strengthen the feeling that he has for that. That's just the way our heart works. And so the more deposits that you make of yourself into any pursuit, thoughts, deeds, words, your resolve or your affection for that pursuit is going to grow. The repeated withdrawal of yourself from any pursuit, the withdrawal of your thoughts and your words and your deeds is going to diminish your feelings for that pursuit. The opposite is true as well. The more that you don't participate in something, the more that you don't talk about it or talk negatively about it, the more that you don't think about it or the more that you think negatively about it, then that's going to diminish the feeling that you have for whatever the pursuit is. And so someone that loves golf can learn to hate golf. And someone that hates golf can learn to love it. You see, you can change your feelings by your behavior, by the way that you, by the things that you do, by the things that you say, by the things that you think. The choices that define our feelings include all of our choices. That is so important for us to get. The choices that define our feelings include all of our choices. It's not just what we do. It's what we say about what we do that also affects our feelings. It's not just what we do and say. It's how we think about what we do and say that also affects our choices. Let's take your job for an instance. Let's say that every day you go to your job and you work really hard. I mean, you always do your job. And you do your job right. You do your job right. But let's say that while you're doing your job right and while you're working hard at your job, this is what you're saying to yourself. This is what you're thinking about your job. I'm not appreciated here. I'm the only one who works hard. Everybody else is just, I have to take up the slack for everyone else. My bosses are bad managers of our workplace. I am not paid enough for the job that I do. When you say those kinds of things to yourself, even though you're working really hard at what you do, how do you feel about your job? I mean, it's going to be hard for you to love your job if the things that you say to yourself, the things that you think about concerning your job, are all things that say that this ain't worth it, that this is not, that there's some inequity about what I do. And so your feelings are going to be affected by the things that you're thinking, the things that you're reciting to yourself. And it's hard to overcome that, right? Because my thoughts are a behavior just like my actions are a behavior. And if I then, have water cooler conversations where I say to my fellow workers, our bosses don't know what they're doing. Or I'm the only one that does any work around here, and I'm not appreciated for it. You see that when you add to what you're thinking, the things that you're saying, then that's really going to make you feel even worse about it. Do you see the point? And if my actions and my words and my thoughts, if they affect my feelings, you know what's going to happen? My feelings are going to affect my behavior. Because another truth that is just so is that our feelings influence our behavior. Feelings do influence our choices. They don't dictate our choices. Our feelings do fuel our behaviors. They do put pressure on our will. And the more that we surrender or we consent to our feelings, then the stronger that they become. Is that not so? That's how we find ourselves in some kind of habit that controls us. Because you see, the first time that we took a smoke, the first time that we took a drink, it didn't even taste that good. We didn't even enjoy it. We coughed and we sputtered and all that kind of stuff. And yet, the more that you repeat the behavior, the more that you repeat the choice, pretty soon there are feelings that are attached to that. And there are chemical releases that happen in your body because whenever you're stressed, you smoke. Or whenever you're worried, you take a drink. And so now that behavior has become something that's how you cope with difficult choices, or how you cope with stress, or what you do after you eat a meal. And so now there are all these connections that are made in your life that all reinforce the choice. And so the feelings get stronger the more that behavior is repeated, so that it becomes something that it's hard to break. It's hard to get out of your life because it's rooted so deeply into the choices that you've made over and over and over again. But please note that the feeling didn't dictate the choice. The choice is what created the appetite. It's what created the feeling. And the repetition of the choice makes the feeling stronger. So that there's this well of emotion, this well of feeling that is all released when we do the thing that we've taught our heart to love. And so if you ask the question, which came first, the feeling or the choice, it's always the choice. But once you've made the choice and you create an appetite for it, then the feeling almost controls us, because we've surrendered or we've consented our will to the leadership of our feelings. But that's a choice that we made. We are not the victims of our feelings. But our feelings do influence our choices. See the difference, if you would, between man and beast? Beasts are creatures of appetite. They're creatures of instinct. But God made us differently. God didn't just make us creatures of appetite. He made us creatures of choice. You and I have free will. And we have the power with our free will even to make choices that are contrary to the way that we feel. We can do things that we hate sometimes, and we can change the way that we feel about those things. Animals don't do that, but creatures of reason can do that. And because our choices are not dictated by our feelings, that's part of what makes us accountable. If it's so that I have to do the thing that I feel, do you see that I wouldn't be responsible? If I were led completely by how I feel, but God didn't make me that way. He made me a creature of choice. He made it possible for me to make decisions. And He even makes decisions that are contrary to my feelings. And that's part of what makes us responsible to Him. If we are creatures of appetite, then God should not hold us accountable for our choices. The fact that God does says that we are creatures of reason. We are creatures of will. We are creatures of choice, because God has given us a capacity that's equal to being created in His image. An important truth about feelings is that our feelings will not change unless we change our behaviors. Do you see that? My feeling about something won't change until I change my behavior. I am not going to start caring about heaven if I make no investments in heaven. Do you see that in Jesus' text here? I'm not going to start to love heaven. I'm not going to dream about it if I don't make any investments in thinking about heaven. If I'm never talking about that land that we're going to. If I never sing about, behold, he comes, riding on the clouds. If I never think about his coming again and what that will be like and the splendor and the awesomeness of the revelation of Jesus Christ, if I don't think about Judgment Day, if I don't choose to do that kind of thing, I'm not going to have any feeling either of reverence for him as the judge or of affection for him as their king who's going to make his royal appearance. If all I do is invest myself in things here, then I'm going to care more about my retirement. I'm going to care more about my house. I'm going to care more about my stuff. I'm going to get all riled up about people that mess up my stuff because I care about things rather than caring about him, about eternity. And so the only way to change my feelings is to change my behavior. And that means all my behaviors. What I do, what I think, and what I say. Our willpower for right will be weak unless we invest in choices that increase our resolve. And our willpower for wrong will be strong unless we invest in choices that diminish our motivation. Our feelings will not change immediately, however. It's going to take time. It's only when we've made enough choices that are counter or opposed to our past feelings that our old feelings will wane and our new feelings will take their place. If I've been laying up lots of treasure here on earth and then start laying up treasure in heaven, it's going to take a little while before I diminish all this built up desire for things here and really have a strong desire for things there. It's going to take some time to do that. But it can be done. I just need to understand that it's going to take some time for my feelings to change. We are all the same in this regard. We are all the same. Every one of us are wired the same way. God's given us the same heart. And our will is sovereign in our heart. It's sovereign over our feelings. We can learn to love things. We can learn to hate things. We can learn to feel indifferent about things. We can learn to love things that we hate, and we can learn to hate things that we love. We change our feelings because we change our choices. If that were not the case, then God could not judge us by the same standard. But He does judge us by the same standard because all of our hearts are the same way. So let me make a few applications to us before we close this morning. Let's look at the matter that Jesus is giving attention here in Matthew chapter 6. He's talking about where we find our feelings about security, where we find our feelings about well-being. And the thing that he's warning us about here in Matthew chapter 6 is about deriving our security and our well-being from the things that we store up here on earth. And so he says, don't lay up for yourselves treasure here on earth. You know why? Because there is nothing that you can store up here on earth that you can make absolutely secure. You can buy all the insurance that you want, and you cannot. That doesn't mean that all your stuff is protected. And so it's not protected from the elements. It can rust. It's not protected from the moth, and it can't be protected from the vice of men. And so no matter what you do to lock up your stuff, no matter what you do to build a fence around it, no matter what you do to make it secure, there is no way that you can make your stuff here secure. And so if all you're doing is trying to store up and secure stuff here, that is folly. And so he says the thing that we need to do is we need to invest ourselves in heaven. We need to invest ourselves in the pursuit of God. Because He's the only one that can give us absolute security. But the only way to feel that, the only way to feel that security is to make the investment. It's to pour yourself into a relationship with God. It's to pour yourself into doing kingdom things. It's to invest yourself in service. It's to invest yourself in care. It's to invest yourself in worship. It's to invest yourself in prayer. It's to invest yourself in all the things that mean that I'm running after God. And when I do that, guess what will happen? I will feel secure. It's tied to what he says in the rest of the passage when he says in verse 25, "For this reason I say to you, don't be anxious for your life." Now, where does anxiety come from? Well, anxiety comes from investing in the wrong place. If everything you've got is poured into things that are here, then all you're going to do is worry about who's going to take it away from you or what's going to happen to it. But if you're investing in things that are eternal and things that are spiritual, nobody can touch it. Nobody can take it away. And so anxiety goes away when you're seeking first the kingdom and His righteousness. The Lord's going to take care of the rest. And so the only way to change my feelings about that are to change my choices. Look, if you would, at what Paul says in Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. And beginning in verse 1 of that text. Paul says, "If then you've been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things that are on the earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with Him in glory. Therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. For it is on account of these things that the wrath of God will come. And in them you also once walked, but when you were living in them. But now put them all aside: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth." I just want you to notice that everything that Paul says there is a behavior. He tells us the things to think about, to set our mind on. He tells us the things to talk about. He tells us a story that reveals to us who we are. We have died with Jesus. We have risen with Jesus. You know where our life is? It's in heaven where He is. And so, if that's so, if that story is true, if our life is hidden in Christ, if we've died with Him and if we've been raised with Him, then how ought we to behave? And how do I put to death these things that he's talking about? My envy. How do I put to death my slander? How do I put to death these impurity and passion and evil desire? How do I change those things? Well, I change those things because I change the way I think, I change the way I talk, I change the way I act, so that I get rid of feeling greedy, and I get rid of feeling impure, and I get rid of evil desire. But the only way to change those things is to change my behavior. And he uses strong behavior words there. I have got to crucify the man I used to be. I've got to mortify, which means that I go to war against the way I feel about things. When I think something that's not right, I don't entertain that in my mind. I crucify the thought that's wrong. I put it to death. I condemn it in my heart. Because if I rehearse that over and over again in my heart, guess what's going to happen? The lust is going to get stronger. And I might be acting, I might be doing the right thing, but the desire is growing. And if I'm talking about it, then I just keep building it up in my heart. The only way to change that is to mortify all my behaviors. I've got to change the way that I act. Otherwise, the feeling is going to stay there. And so Paul says so much here about the way that I think, about what I set my mind on, and about what I do. Because if my actions are not revolutionary, then the change in my heart isn't going to be revolutionary either. Look with me at Genesis chapter 4. And here's a good example of how we feel about people and how that can be affected too. Look at Genesis chapter 4 and the story here about Cain and Abel. The man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and she said, I've gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. And again she gave birth to his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. And Abel on his part also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. Now I want you to think about what choices does Cain make next that put him in a bad way? God accepted his little brother Abel's offering, but he didn't accept his offering. So we're not told about any conversations here. We're not told about any actions that Cain took. But we are told about what he looked like, about his countenance. It says in the middle of verse 5, so Cain became very angry and his countenance fell. Is there a conversation that's going on in his heart right now? When he's angry and his heart and his countenance has fallen? Yeah. He is talking to himself about how sorry his brother Abel is. About how he showed him up again, maybe. And he's telling himself a story about Abel that puts the fault for his not finding acceptance with his sacrifice to God, that puts the burden of that all on his brother. And so he's making his brother a villain, and he's making himself the victim in the story that he's telling himself. As if the whole reason why his offering wasn't accepted by God was just because of his brother. Now, do you see that his behavior, and here the things that he's thinking, the things that he's telling himself, all of that is creating this feeling in him of anger. And how's he going to stop that? The only way to stop that is to start telling himself another story. So often our feelings are created by stories that we tell ourselves that are not true or that are half true. We tell ourselves little fables or half-truths. We might tell part of the story, but it's not all of the story. And so the Lord tries to intervene here and tries to tell Cain the truth about what has happened. And so look at what the Lord does to tell him a different story. He says in verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry?" That's a good question. Why are you angry, Cain? I mean, what should Cain feel? What would be the right feeling for him to have? He ought to feel remorse, right? He ought to feel regret. He ought to feel shame over the fact that he didn't bring to God an offering that was acceptable. He ought to feel conviction about that. But instead he has a feeling that doesn't make sense in light of what's happened here. But the feeling's been created by his own behavior. And so he says, "Why are you angry and why has your countenance fallen?" Listen to what he says in verse 7. "If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door and its desire is for you, but you must master it." Cain was responsible for his feelings. He had the responsibility to master the way that he felt. It's interesting to me that when the Lord addresses him, the name of Abel doesn't come up at all. He doesn't say anything about Abel, because this had nothing to do with Abel. This had to do with Cain and his actions. But Cain doesn't change his behavior. His anger only grows. And so in verse 8 it says, "And Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about that when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. And so he let his feelings lead him, because he took no steps, made no provisions to change the way that he felt." And so how I feel about other people is a behavioral thing. How I act, what I say, what I think is going to affect the way that I behave. One final passage before we close this morning. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1. And I want us to think for a moment from this text just about our feelings for the Word, our appetite for the Word. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 22. Peter says, since you have in obedience to the truth purified your souls for a sincere love of the brethren, fervently love one another from the heart. Isn't it something that he can command us to feel a certain way? Now, the only way he can command us to feel a certain way is if I can affect the way that I feel by my choices. And so he says, because we have, out of obedience to the truth, purified our souls, we've been sanctified to love each other. So guess what we ought to do? Love each other. Love each other, he says, from the heart. For you've been born again, not of seed which is perishable, but imperishable. That is through the living and abiding Word of Christ. How do I learn to sincerely love my brother? Well, I remember what God has done for me. I have been born again. And so that rebirth, I act like someone that's been born again. And someone that's been born again not from corruptible seed, but from incorruptible seed. And so thinking about that helps to drive my behavior. Then he says in verse 1 of chapter 2, therefore, putting aside all malice and guile and hypocrisy and envy and slander, like newborn babes, long for the pure milk of the word, that by it you may grow in respect to salvation, if you tasted the kindness of the Lord. Sometimes that passage gets used to talk about how when you're a new Christian, you need the milk of the word. I want you to see that's not the point of the passage. He's not talking about new Christians here. He's talking about all Christians. And he's saying that all of us ought to have a longing to be nursed by the Word of God. We ought to have an appetite for the Word that is the kind of craving that a little baby has for his or her mother's milk. That there ought to be that kind of desire for the Word of God because we have tasted how kind the Lord is. How do you get that kind of appetite? I mean, if your Bible, if the Word sits like this in your house, and it's in the back window of the car, or it's just on the coffee table, or it's just on the bookshelf, and every Sunday you got to go find it. I mean, is the Word, is it a longing in your life? If you don't talk about it, if you're not thinking about it, then are you craving it the way that a baby does? Milk? I mean, you don't, do you? And how do you get that kind of appetite? Well, you get it by the choices that you make. If you're not in the Word, you're not going to taste the kindness of the Lord. If you're not in the Word, then you're not going to be able to put away slander and malice and guile and all those things. If you're not in the Word, you're not going to learn to love your brother. You're not going to be born of seed that is imperishable. Because the things that feed your behavior are going to be things that are carnal. And so that appetite is an appetite that I learn because I'm making choices that expose me to it so that I taste how kind the Lord is, how gracious He is. And that starts to, I talk about it, I think about it, and that changes the way that I behave. Don't lay up for yourself treasures here on earth where moth and rust corrupt and where thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Because where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Such an important truth for us not to be defined by how we feel, but to define how we feel by the choices that we make, by where we invest ourselves. Let's invest ourselves in God's things so that we will feel affection for God's things and not for things that have no place to be lifted up, to be lofty, to be great in our heart. Because where your treasure is, there will your heart be. Do you treasure Jesus? If you don't think about Him, if you don't talk about Him, if you don't live for Him, you're not going to treasure Him. But if you are thinking about Him and talking about Him, and if you're choosing Him, and if you're ready to commit and surrender your life to Him today'd be a great day to do that. And that choice, that behavior will only be reinforced the more that you live for Him, the more that you think for Him, the more that you talk for Him. Won't you come and lay your burdens at the cross this morning and find forgiveness there as together we stand and as we sing.